Afternoon. In a certain pond on one of the farms in the east were 2 ducks and a frog. Now these neighbors were the best of friends, and all day long they used to play together. But as the hot summer days came, the pond began to dry up, and soon there was such a little bit of water that they all realized they would have to move. Now the ducks could easily fly to another place, but what about their friend, the frog? Finally, it was decided that they would put a stick in the bill of each duck, and then the frog would hang onto the stick with his mouth, and they would fly into another pond. And so they did. As they were flying, a farmer out in his field looked up and saw them and said, "Well, isn't that a clever idea? I wonder who thought of it." The frog said, "I did." And down he falls. See, Mr. Frog succumbed to his pride and suffered the consequences. When we succumb to pride, we will suffer the consequences, whether that be in this life or in the life to come. There are consequences for pride. And there's a particular man in the Old Testament that suffers with this especially. If you'd like to turn in your Bibles to Daniel chapter 2, we're going to be looking at Nebuchadnezzar. And God uses 3 ways to humble King Nebuchadnezzar. We're going to entitle this God's Humble Pie. So God serves Nebuchadnezzar 3 pieces of this humble pie. Daniel chapter 2. Let's look at verse 11. Now Nebuchadnezzar has just had a dream of which he cannot interpret. None of his magicians can interpret. And so he needs help. Verse 11. Moreover, the matter which the king asks is difficult, and there is no one else who could declare it to the king except gods. Now these are magicians talking to King Nebuchadnezzar, saying, "Listen, what you're asking of us, no man can do. It's only God that can accomplish this task. Who could declare to the king except gods, whose dwelling place is not with flesh." So now look down at verse 27. Daniel answered before the king and said, "As for the mystery about which the king is asking, neither wise men, conjurers, magicians, nor diviners are able to declare it to the king. However, there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will take place in the last days. This was your dream and the visions of your head while on your bed." God knows about Nebuchadnezzar's problem with pride. And so the first piece of humble pie that God serves Nebuchadnezzar is by demonstrating his power. God, by demonstrating his power, humbles Nebuchadnezzar for a period. Sadly, look at verse 47 of chapter 2. What does King Nebuchadnezzar say? The king answered Daniel and said, "Truly, your God is a God of gods and a Lord of kings, and a revealer of mysteries, since you have been able to reveal this mystery." I think it's interesting how Nebuchadnezzar, we'll see how this progresses as we go through each piece of the pie, but right now, Nebuchadnezzar thinks this God is a God of gods, meaning he believes in other gods as well. He just thinks that this God is pretty powerful. But God has demonstrated his power to King Nebuchadnezzar, and it humbles him for a while. Does God demonstrate his power to us today? Yes, he does. Look at Romans chapter 1. Romans chapter 1, beginning in verse 18. Here Paul says, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. Because of that which is known about God is evident within them, for God made it evident to them." Here's the key, verse 20. "For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, both his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse." God is actively trying to humble us through his creation. Every one of us should be able to look out into nature, look out into the world, see God's power, see his divine attributes, and that should humble us. Does it humble us? Do we look at Big Frog Mountain and do we see God's power? Is that what we think about? Do we look at a garden and do we see God's care and God's love for his creation? Do we see God's attributes? Do we see his power? And does that humble us? Or is it because we're in his nature, we're in this creation all the time, that we've hardened our hearts? That we can look at nature and not think about God? Does it humble us? Are we aware that God is serving us this piece of humble pie? Turn in your Bibles to 2 Corinthians chapter 4. How else does God demonstrate his power to us today? 2 Corinthians chapter 4, beginning in verse 7. Here again, Paul says, "But we have this treasure in earthen vessels, so that the surpassing greatness of the power will be of God and not from ourselves." Do we look at our brothers and sisters in this room, and are we reminded of God's power? His ability to take sinful, wretched, unclean, miserable human beings and use them for his will and accomplish his will. Does that humble us? Does God's church, does his creation, when we look at it, does it humble us? Or have we hardened our hearts and let it become commonplace? Let ourselves grow used to it. Because God is serving us humble pie right now. By being in his creation, by being in this building right now. Are we accepting this piece of humble pie? Or do we need to go on to the next piece? Let's see how else God humbles King Nebuchadnezzar. Turn back to Daniel. Let's look at chapter 3 now. Daniel chapter 3, beginning in verse 13. King Nebuchadnezzar has just raised up this golden statue. I find it interesting that Daniel has just, through God, interpreted to King Nebuchadnezzar the meaning of his dream. It says that he is the head of gold. And it seems like the only thing that King Nebuchadnezzar takes away from this interpretation is that he's the head of gold, and so he makes a statue of gold for people to worship. Look at verse 13, Daniel chapter 3. "Then Nebuchadnezzar in rage and wrath said to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Then these men were brought before the king. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said to them, 'Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you are not serving my gods, and do not worship the golden image that I have set up? Now if you are ready, at that time you hear the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, and bagpipe, and all kinds of music. Then you shall fall down and worship the image that I have made. But if you do not worship, you will immediately be cast into the midst of a furnace of blazing fire. And what God is there who can save you out of my hands? Poor Nebuchadnezzar is also suffering from amnesia, apparently. Verse 16. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to respond to you with an answer concerning this matter. If it be so, our God, whom we serve, remember the God who interpreted your dream, is able to save us from the furnace of blazing fire, and he will save us out of your hand, O king. So number one, God's first piece of humble pie is he demonstrates his power. God's second piece of humble pie is God foils plans. Nebuchadnezzar has plans, and God is going to foil them. Look at verse 19. Then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with wrath, and the image of his face changed toward Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He answered and said to heat the furnace 7 times more than it was usually heated. Flip over verse 28. Look at verse 26, rather. Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the furnace of blazing fire. He answered and said, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, come out, you servants of the Most High God, and come here. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the midst of the fire. God had foiled Nebuchadnezzar's plans, and it humbled him. He recognized God's power. He recognized he is the Most High God. Look at verse 28. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and saved his servants who put their trust in him, violating the king's word, and gave up their bodies so as to not serve and not to worship any god except their own God. Therefore I make a decree that any people, nation, or tongue that says anything offensive against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses reduced to a rubbish heap, inasmuch as there is no other God who is able to deliver in this way. God foils Nebuchadnezzar's plans, and Nebuchadnezzar recognizes God's power. Now here's where it gets a little tricky. We cannot look at a moment in our life and say beyond a shadow of a doubt that God has foiled a plan of ours. Because God hasn't revealed that to us today. But perhaps God has foiled plans that we've made. Why would God foil any plans that we have? Flip over to Luke. Flip over to the Gospel of Luke, verse 12. Chapter 12. Luke chapter 12, beginning in verse 16. Luke 12, beginning in verse 16. And he told them a parable, saying, The land of a rich man was very productive, and he began reasoning to himself, saying, What shall I do, since I have no place to store my crops? Then he said, This is what I will do. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, Soul, you have many goods laid up for many years to come. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, You fool, this very night your soul is required of you, and now who will own what you have prepared? So is the one who stores up treasures for himself and is not rich towards God. Why would God foil any plans? Because perhaps those plans that we've made don't involve Him. They're for our satisfaction, they're for our glory, instead of vice versa. we cannot say beyond a shadow of a doubt that God has foiled a particular plan. But can we? Can we look at different circumstances or different situations in our life and say, is God perhaps trying to humble me right now? Can we take stock of our life? Examine our life through this mirror and say, perhaps God is trying to humble me by foiling my plans. And it works for a little bit on Nebuchadnezzar. Which brings us to our final piece of humble pie. Flip back to Daniel chapter 4. Daniel chapter 4. Look at verse 30. Daniel 4 and verse 30. The king, speaking of Nebuchadnezzar, answered and said, is this not Babylon the Great, which I myself have built as a royal house by the strength of my power and for the glory of my majesty? While the word was in the king's mouth, a voice came from heaven saying, King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is said, the kingdom has been removed from you, and you will be driven away from mankind, and your place of habitation will be with the beasts of the field. You will be given grass to eat like cattle, and 7 periods of time will pass over you, until you know that the Most High is the powerful ruler over the kingdom of mankind and gives it to whomever he wishes. Third piece of humble pie that God serves is taking away. God takes away. Perhaps God has taken away from your life, or God has taken away from my life in certain situations. Perhaps God has taken a job that you think is beneficial, a job that you think is going to be helpful. But perhaps this job is just going to pull you away from him. Or maybe God takes away financial security because too much reliance on money instead of reliance on God. Perhaps God has taken away from your life because you need to be humble. We all struggle with pride. We all need to evaluate our life. And when certain situations come up, are we going to be aware? Are we going to take stock of our life and think, perhaps God is trying to humble me in this situation? And if we humble ourselves in every situation that we encounter, no matter whether God has his hand in it or not, wouldn't that be pleasing to God? To when we lose a job, but God has nothing to do with it at all, and we humble ourselves and say, God, I'm going to rely on you. Or when our financial security is taken away, say, God, my reliance, my strength, my hope is in you. It's not in myself, it's not in money, it's not in these physical things, it's in you. God is actively today serving us the first piece of humble pie. We can look in creation, we can look in this building right here and see God's power, and it should humble us. But if that doesn't work, are we ready for the second piece of humble pie of God foiling plans? And are we ready for the third piece of humble pie of God taking away? And you know who's thankful for these three pieces of humble pie? Nebuchadnezzar. Because what does he say? Verse 34. But at the end of those days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted up my eyes toward heaven, and my knowledge returned to me. And I blessed the Most High, and praised and honored him who lives forever. For his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom endures from generation to generation, and all the inhabitants of the earth are accounted as nothing. But he does according to his will in the host of heaven, and among the inhabitants of the earth, and no one can strike against his hand or say to him, what have you done? Verse 37. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise, exalt, and honor the King of heaven. For all his works are true and his ways just, and he is able to humble those who walk in pride. Nebuchadnezzar is thankful for those three pieces of humble pie. And isn't it kind of neat to think that perhaps Nebuchadnezzar is going to be in heaven with us someday? Because of those three pieces of humble pie. We have a choice. Every time we encounter these situations or these potential situations where God might be humbling us, we have a choice to throw those pieces of pie to the side and trust in self and hang on to our pride. And thankfully, Nebuchadnezzar chose to swallow those pieces of pie, and we can do the same thing today. Let's humble ourselves before God, just like Nebuchadnezzar did. We only have these three recorded instances in Nebuchadnezzar's life. And perhaps God has been working on Nebuchadnezzar's pride a lot longer than we have recorded. Aren't you thankful that God keeps working on us? That God gives us ample opportunities? He allowed each of us to wake up this morning, to look at His creation, to recognize His power and humble ourselves. He gave us the opportunity to sit in this building surrounded by brothers and sisters in Christ who are equally as flawed as ourselves, and who yet God still uses. And He gave us the opportunity to humble ourselves. Are we going to let those opportunities slip away? Humble yourself before God. Because He is powerful. Because He is King. And how often we make ourselves king of our lives. If you're here this afternoon and you're still on the fence of making God, of making Jesus, the King of your life. It's a pride problem. Because we like being in control. Give up that control. Let God master you. Quit holding on to it. Because just like that frog, it will end in our destruction. Believe that Jesus is the Son of God. And act on that by repenting, by giving up control of your life. I'm no longer in control. God is in control. And just like was mentioned this morning in class, that's a day-by-day, hour-by-hour, minute-by-minute decision that we make to give God the control. Confess Jesus as Lord, not just now, every single day of your life. Put Christ on in baptism. So many have to stop right there for some reason because of pride. Because they are not willing to be dunked in water, believing that Jesus' blood is going to contact them because of pride. Have humility. Submit to what God says. Put Christ on in baptism. And don't let it stop there. Put yourself to death every single day of your life and make Christ the King. If you have need, please come as we stand and as we sing.
A great position now is there a sympathize in Jesus. He speaks, unproving, hard to share of him, the voice of Jesus.